Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Friday, November the 14th. It's been quite a week for American foreign policy and for American foreign policy on this show. We did a show a couple of days ago with the DC-based foreign policy analyst, William Hartung, who's concerned about what he calls, what he describes as the $1 trillion war machine that's being built by the Pentagon. He believes it will bankrupt America. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has spent the week flexing American power. He spent the earlier part of the week in Gaza. He was in Egypt. He came back to DC, met with the president of Argentina. He has plans to talk to Putin and Zelensky and go to South Korea. And of course, been very much involved in Venezuela, where America seems on the brink of some sort of war. For some people, this might represent a week which would warn about American power. But for my guest today, American power is a good thing in the second quarter of the 21st century. Shadi Hamid is a columnist for the Washington Post. He recently wrote a piece called Why I Chose to Root for U.S. Dominance. It's very much bound up in his new book, The Case for American Power. Shadi Hamid is joining us from Washington, D.C. Shadi, congratulations on the new book. It's out this week. What is the case for American power? Some people might argue that this would be a week in which would be lessons against the case for American power. I know you're not a big fan of Donald Trump, and I don't want to turn this into just another Trump bashing exercise, but what is the case for American power?
Yeah. Hi, Andrew. Thank you. I should probably be clear from the outset that when I talk about American power, I'm not talking about Trump's version of America, which I very much don't share and disagree with pretty strongly. But I do think that the badness of Donald Trump shouldn't prevent us from appreciating America's role in the world and insisting that we do have a role to play in the first place. I do think that the U.S. is far preferable to the available alternatives. And the alternatives here, I'm referring to China and Russia primarily. These are brutal dictatorships. And if we cede the ground, if we acknowledge our own decline and say, hey, we're out of this, if that happens in the coming years or decades, then that doesn't necessarily mean a better, more just world. It probably means a more chaotic world, because then you'll have Russian expansionism, which we've seen in the case of Ukraine. We've seen China's aggression towards Taiwan. These are cautionary tales about the alternative world. So I think what we have to do is not compare the US to some perfect moral superpower, because that moral superpower that's apparently perfect does not exist and will not exist. We have to live in the world as it currently is. And that means choosing from the available options. And America has been capable of good things in the past. It's a checkered record. Sometimes we've done awful things in certain regions of the world during certain periods of time. But I think all in all, the post-World War II order that the U.S. has helped build is something worth preserving and protecting.
This was also a week where Gavin Newsom went to the COPE conference and talked about the value of new kinds of energy on the environmental front. Is Newsom an example of an American politician who's manifesting responsible American power?
Yeah, I think I'm somewhat optimistic about Gavin Newsom. I still haven't made a decision about who I'm supporting in 2028. It's a little bit too early for that. But I do think that we've had Democrats in the past who have had a more responsible view of how to use American power, especially post Iraq War. I think the Iraq War showed Democrats the dangers of overextension, the dangers of using military force as the first option instead of the last option, which would be my preference. So I think here you see different examples of politicians who have different approaches to US power. But I think the bigger point here is that American power is not intrinsically bad. We are not some font of evil and destruction. America is capable of doing good. And as long as we remember that, that I think is the important thing. And one thing I worry about is that a growing number of liberals and Democrats in this country are losing faith in American power and in the American idea more broadly. There's actually a remarkable poll from Gallup that demonstrates this quite well, that in the early 2000s, about 85% of Democrats were either extremely or very proud to be American. That number has now dropped in 2025 to just 36%. It's one of the most precipitous drops I've seen in polling on any kind of poll, really, in recent years. So that shows us that there is this kind of self-loathing, even sometimes a self-hatred that animates too many Americans. And that's something I want to push back against.
Yeah, and this is very much of a personal book, and it's more a book on the left to progressives than I think to conservatives. There was an interesting review of your book in Quillette that says that Shadi Hamid has an uneasy conscience and he doesn't yet know what to do with it. I'm not sure if that's true, but this is certainly a very personal narrative, isn't it, Shadi? You are from an Egyptian family. You've been pretty outspoken on US policy towards the Middle East, particularly Israel and Gaza. So you have this awkward, complicated relationship with the United States. Is that fair? Or certainly that's the narrative in your life. You studied overseas. Now you're a distinguished Washington Post columnist, but you've also been historically a critic of American foreign policy, the two post 9/11 wars in the Middle East in particular.
Yeah, that's right. And this book it's part memoir, part history, part foreign policy analysis. So there's a lot in there. And one thing I try to do is to trace my own political and ideological evolution from 9/11 until the present day. I kind of had my formative moments because of 9/11. After 9/11, I was a freshman in college when the attacks happened, and they changed my life. I probably wouldn't even be here talking to you if it wasn't for that day. That's what politicized me and pushed me to become a writer. And I think also the Iraq War was critical. I was very active in the anti-war movement, organizing die-ins, teach-ins. I actually helped organize a tent encampment on my own campus before tent encampments were cool. So I have that kind of experience that I think a lot of leftists go through, of reading Noam Chomsky, of being very critical of almost everything the US does, and putting the blame on America first, blaming America first, I should say. And so I've had to kind of contend with my own history. And I think one thing I realized is, while I was protesting, I was outside of the White House with my signs and doing all of that sort of thing, is people power didn't work. And we weren't able to stop the Iraq War. There was actually a coordinated day of protest where millions across the globe were speaking out against the war, but we weren't able to stop it. And so one conclusion I came to was that it's actually the people who seek power, who are in the halls of power, that are able to shape history, because it was the neocons around George W. Bush who were able to capture the levers of power and push us into this destructive war. So I thought to myself after that, I don't want to be on the outside looking in. I don't want to be protesting the rest of my life. I want to actually be influencing power instead of merely opposing it. And that's the course that I would advise for the left going forward, that the left should be more comfortable with power instead of seeing power as inherently bad and corrupting. Power is inevitable. Someone has to wield it. So the only question from my standpoint is, who is going to wield it? Will it be us as Americans, or will it be our competitors? And that's really what it comes down to for me, that there is no real alternative to American power. Or I should say there are alternatives, but they are not particularly appealing. So that's part of my own.
Who are you
Yeah.
arguing against? I mean, I take your point on protesting and being on the outside and everything else you've said. But who exactly are you arguing against? I mean, are you turning Chomsky into a kind of straw man? I mean, he's a very, very old man. I've always thought his arguments were slightly absurd. I'm never quite sure why people took him seriously. But are there grown-ups, Shadi, in the world today who take this position that America has no right to exercise its power? Who are you thinking of?
I think there's a pretty popular and mainstream view, especially among liberals and Democrats, that American power is not a good thing.
Well,
At least
can
it
you give me
is.
some examples of people who articulate that?
I mean, I think it's actually the predominant position now. I think
I
I'm
take
the
your
out.
point, but give me some examples, because I can't think of anyone.
I would say, AOC, Bernie Sanders, Zoran Mamdani. I mean, I agree with them on a lot of things, but I think there's a sense that American power has to be restrained. I think you also have people associated with the Quincy Institute that
Yeah,
argue for
that's his
this.
Hartung, who was on my show. So he's a
Yeah,
Quincy guy.
yeah, I
Who
think
we-
that.
Sorry, go
But
on.
I think also even Barack Obama was a representative of this, in not wanting to exercise American power in Syria. His foreign policy motto was "Don't do stupid shit." He was mostly about avoiding doing things instead of offering an affirmative vision for America's role in the world. There was that whole debacle about leading from behind. So I think there is a profound discomfort, not just post 9/11, post Iraq War, but post Vietnam War, where the liberal left, has a kind of awkward relationship with power, and a sense that we shouldn't dirty our hands too much with it. And I think that my view is I think that.
Yeah, and then next week we've got a show with Chris Matthews. He's written a book celebrating the 100th year of RFK's birth. Is there an alternative tradition in the Democratic Party, perhaps on the left, a kind of Bobby Kennedy muscularity when it comes to changing the world, which has been lost?
I do think that we have that foreign policy tradition in the Democratic Party, but we've lost sight of it. And I think the Biden administration, because it was so awful on Gaza and helped facilitate what I consider to be a genocide, I think that's another example of how Democrats have forfeited their international role, and Democrats not being able to really present an affirmative version. And I think recovering from Gaza and reckoning with Gaza will be a major part of the rebuilding that has to happen. We have to persuade the rest of the world that we are fit to hold power. And that can only be done by acknowledging the sins that we've committed. And that's why my book, actually, I would say that Noam Chomsky had a lot right. I think his diagnosis is often on target, that we've done terrible things abroad. My issue with Chomsky and others like him is that there is no positive vision. There is no prognosis of what American power should be. It's always about.
It's about power, as you say. I mean, you spend a lot of the time in the book arguing that you just have to realize power. That's just the nature of things. You have to accept it. Are there models? You mentioned the Biden administration's lack of moral backbone when it came to Gaza. You criticize Obama on Syria. We did some shows a few years ago on that. Are there examples of progressive American politicians? Brzezinski comes to mind, for example. He's a centrist. He's controversial on both sides. Maybe a more progressive version of Henry Kissinger. Ed Luce has written a wonderful biography of him.
Yeah.
Ed was on the show a couple of months ago. Are there models for you that of people who recognize, come to terms with American power, and perhaps Brzezinski, and recognize that we have to not only acknowledge it, but use it?
Yeah, I think there are examples. Brzezinski is obviously one. I think that JFK, FDR, as we already mentioned, but I would add someone on the right who I think somewhat counterintuitively offers some inspiration, and that's George W. Bush. If we kind of take out the Iraq War as
that's
the disaster,
a big takeout, Shadi.
I know. If we take it out as a disaster that it was, what I appreciated about George W. Bush was he actually was using American leverage with our allies and pressuring allies like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and others to open up their political systems. And I think that he had something called the Freedom Agenda at that time in 2004, 2005. And that idea of melding the idea of power with our moral purpose, finding a way to combine them instead of treating them as separate things that are somehow in opposition. And so, in other words, using our power to promote moral ends. And I think that if we have this kind of leverage with our allies, and the fact that we support still autocratic allies in the Middle East, that is a moral stain on our record. And being able to put pressure on Egypt and Saudi Arabia, I think would be a positive step.
Right, so I take your point, but then some people might be listening and suggesting you've spoken up in favor of Bush. I mean, you're really making the neocon argument. I mean, Wolfowitz would have argued that he wanted to improve the Middle East. He wanted to bring democracy to the region, and he was doing good. Maybe the wars didn't work out as he wanted, but where does your argument end here? As long as you want to make the world a better place, does that justify American power? At what point could Nixon and Kissinger be included in your camp of realists?
But Kissinger had no real sense of moral purpose, and he was very comfortable supporting brutal dictatorships in Latin America, Africa, Asia, you name it. So I don't think Kissinger would really be able to fit into
Nixon, man.
Yeah, I don't think they'd be able to fit into my paradigm. The reason that the Iraq War cannot be justified is we can't just go around toppling any dictator by military force. Otherwise, we've been invading half of the world's countries. So at some level, there has to be some kind of careful, judicious application of military force. But I think it's possible to look at George W. Bush's legacy and distinguish between the bad parts and also to highlight the good parts. It's possible to have a more nuanced approach. And the fact that George W. Bush spoke so eloquently about the fact that all Arabs, deserve freedom and democracy, and that they are not an exception because of their culture or religion, that's actually something that was very refreshing at the time. This idea of universality. Where I disagree is on the use of military force when it's unjustified. My sort of rubric on this is that we should use military force in the event of mass slaughter or genocide, or if there's a mass killing that is ongoing. This is why I was a very forceful advocate of military intervention in Syria. And that's the reason that I'm critical of Obama for kind of not enforcing his own red line. I'm also still to this day a supporter of the NATO intervention in Libya. There was a mass slaughter that was happening in front of our very eyes. Gaddafi was marching towards Benghazi, and the killing would have continued. The bloodletting would have continued. And we had the ability as Americans with our allies to use military force to stop the killing, So this is what I think we have the ability to do.
So would Serbia be another example?
Yes.
The
So
bombing of Serbia?
yes, exactly. I wasn't. I was a young fellow, quite too young to actually take a position at the time. But yes, I am a supporter of what the U.S. did, which was using military force to stop the Bosnian genocide, and also intervening in Kosovo in the late 1990s to stop the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo. I would add another positive example of the use of U.S. power was the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and occupied the country. We were the only power that had the ability to stop that, which we did. So I think that we see a number of examples here: Kosovo, Libya, um, Bosnia, Kuwait, where we can actually say U.S. power was the only option. There was no other alternative. Europe was not going to step in. Europe usually follows the lead of America when it comes to these sorts of things, and Europe doesn't have a unified military command. So at the end of the day, if we want to envision a better, more just, more peaceful world, we have to think about those instances where the use of force is justified. That does not mean Iraq, but it does mean that there are examples where it can be justified.
What about what would be your if you ran U.S. foreign policy? If you were in charge at state, what would be your position on Egypt? Rather nasty military regime, certainly anything but democratic, but not invading other countries. How would you treat Egypt? As obviously this is a country where your family's from, so you must have given it quite a lot of thought.
Yes, indeed. I would say a full suspension of military aid to Egypt. We give them $1.4 billion annually. The Egyptian military would not be able to run without the maintenance, logistical support, spare parts that we provided. This also goes for Saudi Arabia. We could effectively ground the Saudi Air Force if we withdrew our military support from that country. There, these are countries that run on our weapons and depend on our advanced weaponry. So this is where I would advocate a very forceful approach. That doesn't mean we invade Egypt. It doesn't mean we invade Saudi Arabia, but it does mean that we pressure these
So
countries
what would they
through.
have to do, say the Saudis or the Egyptians? So let's take the Saudi example. Would you say, well, you got to stop chopping up opposition journalists, Turkish journalists?
Well, that's
Or do
already
you have to
happened.
include elections, or do you need to allow women to drive? What would be the criteria for reactivating military aid?
Yeah, it would mean, stopping the repression of journalists, stopping the executions of dissidents, moving towards, let's say, local elections, if not national elections. These things take time. I have no expectation that Saudi Arabia would become a democracy overnight, but to at least see positive movement in the right direction, to actually see examples of reform and improvement, and to be able to judge that based on criteria that we've devised. So I think that we haven't seen any of that. We've seen the opposite, in fact. Saudi Arabia has become more oppressive over time, not less. So I think that, and that's not a popular view now. I think that there's very few advocates now for making aid to these countries conditional. But I'm a big proponent of conditionality. I think that if countries want to receive our support, we have a right to ask things of them in return. And the big one here is obviously Israel. Israel is a country that is engaging in that has engaged in mass killing of civilians, of Palestinian civilians, for the better part of 2 years. And I think that that's an example of where U.S. power would be called for. U.S. power would mean and putting pressure on Israel a year ago, more than a year ago, to stop the killing and to end the war and to agree to a ceasefire. But we abdicated our moral responsibility. The Biden administration did, and wasn't willing to use the pressure, the leverage that it had with Israeli leaders. And that's an example of the U.S. stepping back and giving carte blanche to a country that quite frankly does not share our values, does not share our ideals.
Right, Shadi, it's an interesting argument. You wrote a very provocative piece in Time this week in defense of American hypocrisy. And I want to get into the idea of hypocrisy and what you mean by it. But some people might be listening to this and saying, well, who is America, or what is America to be putting down these moral criteria? A country that imprisons legal immigrants, country of massive inequality, of political violence, and so on and so forth. Should or can America, does it have the moral right to be telling the Saudis or the Egyptians or the Ukrainians or anyone else how to behave, given the moral complexity, to put it euphemistically, about contemporary America?
Yeah, I do believe we have the right, because we are morally superior to these regimes. We are a democracy, however flawed we might be. And I take your point that we're not perfect. Of course, we're not perfect, but we were founded on a moral purpose. It's right there in our founding documents. And each president, to one degree or another, up until Donald Trump, reiterated the fact that America has some kind of duty and moral cause to share these ideas with more people throughout the world. And I think that if you look at the record post-World War II, at the conclusion of World War II, only about 8% of the world's countries were democracies. By the 1990s, about 50% of the world's countries were democracies. It's no coincidence that that dramatic expansion of liberty and democracy throughout the world happened because the US was a superpower. First, it was a superpower along with the Soviet Union, but then it became the lone superpower. And that's why in the 1990s, we had the third wave of democratization, where democracy spread throughout Eastern Europe, in parts of Latin America. So the fact that when the superpower is democratic, that has a demonstration effect that inspires people in other countries. And I would also say that we have a right to speak about moral issues because it is our country and we should have a bias towards it. At some level, there is a nationalistic element here. I'm American, so presumably I would want America to dominate in world affairs. And similarly, I'm sure a lot of Chinese people, if not the majority, would want China to be more influential in world affairs. So I don't think we as Americans have to apologize all that much for taking a position which should come naturally to us. This is our country. We should want it to be successful in the world. We should not want it to decline. That doesn't mean we don't criticize it. We should criticize our country where applicable, but we should also want it to play this forward-facing role in world affairs.
Noah Feldman has been on the show, gave your book a nice blurb. He says, Shadi Hamid is a patriot in the self-critical, hopeful tradition of James Baldwin and Martin Luther King. Do you think of yourself as a patriot in that Baldwin, MLK tradition? Obviously, both Black Americans. I'm sure we could find some white Americans to include in it as well.
I've never thought of myself. It would be self-aggrandizing for me to think of myself.
You can be self-aggrandizing on this show, Shadi. You have my permission.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, honestly, I had not until that blurb thought of myself kind of in the same breath as those greats. I fall well short. I do appreciate the blurb from Noah Feldman. It was very kind of him. I am working, I think, in their tradition. And I mean, James Baldwin memorably said, I love America, and therefore I insist on the right to criticize it perpetually. So Baldwin saw the criticism of the U.S. that he was engaging in as being part of his moral duty as a patriot. I think that is the tradition that we need to revive, that we can love our country and be open about loving it. That doesn't mean we whitewash its sins. If anything, the true patriot is the one who comes to terms with the sins of their nation.
Yeah, I take your point on Baldwin. Coming back to Bobby Kennedy, Baldwin organized an event, I think it was in 1963 4 or 5 in Central Park, in which he introduced a group of African-American activists to Bobby Kennedy. And a number of them, they were very critical of not just race in America, but the Vietnam War, saying that they wouldn't fight in a war because they didn't believe in America. Bobby Kennedy was very annoyed and said, well, all Americans should be patriots. But after a couple of days on reflection, he said, yeah, if I'd have been born black, I might agree with them. Can one be a patriot, for example, Shadi, and say refuse to fight in a war, or not even sometimes support one's country's wars overseas, like Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan?
I'm glad you brought up the example of Bobby Kennedy there, because he did go through an evolution, if not a transformation, because he listened to these black dissidents and actually took what they were saying seriously, and he came to a different conclusion after reflecting on it. Would I have wanted to, let's say that there was a draft during the Iraq War, would I have been comfortable serving? No, I wouldn't have been. And I think that it can be a patriotic act to say, as a matter of conscience, that a war is not justified, and that's a personal decision, and that's one that each person has to live with in the eyes of their own God or whatever they believe. And I think that there's nothing about patriotism that requires us to be unquestioning and to say that just because our country is fighting a war, that therefore we have to support it without qualification. So I think that is the tradition that I'm in. And that's why the book actually includes a very long cataloging of our sins, because I want to acknowledge them forthrightly and say, we have a terrible record. We have done a lot of bad things, especially in the Middle East. But my goal is to say that we have to atone for those sins by using our power for more just ends, for moral ends. That has to be our commitment going forward. And, if I want to leave a legacy, that's the kind of legacy I want to leave, that American power needs to be used for moral ends.
And yet also you refer to a book by an old friend of mine, David Runciman, on political hypocrisy. And Runciman is, in a way, sympathetic to the idea of hypocrisy, political hypocrisy. You wrote a column in defense of American hypocrisy, and this is one of the themes in the book. To be a real patriot, then, do we need to have a degree of hypocrisy, Shadi?
Yes, indeed. And this is another counterintuitive argument that I like a lot. And I hope it's surprising to some listeners, because hypocrisy, we automatically think of it as a bad thing, something to be pushed out of public life. But as the French author François La Rochefoucauld famously said, hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. In other words, that the only way that we know that we are being moral is if people can call us out for being hypocritical, because no one's perfect. The point here is that we try to be better than we actually are, and then we fall short of those ideals. But the only way we can fall short of ideals is by acknowledging those ideals in the first place. So you need that kind of moral aspiration. And I think it's telling that our challengers like China and Russia, very rarely are they accused of hypocrisy. The country that is accused of hypocrisy the most is the US. And the reason for that is simple. It's because we aspire to be better, and we put as a kind of goal in front of the world, we say that there are these ideals that we would like to commit to. Again, we fall short. And it's in that gap between ideals and reality, that's where there's a lot of good work that can be done. Because when we realize that we're falling short, that's when we can start improving. That's when we can start to close the gap. And basically, I think there are two ways to close the gap. One is by saying that that the reality and the ideals are too far apart, and therefore we should give up on our ideals. But my view is that would be unfortunate, because then we would live in a purely cynical world.
Right. It's the nihilism. We had earlier this week another very good journalist, Mikhail Zygar, on the show, Russian exile. He has a new book out, The Dark Side of the Earth. And he actually, in our conversation, actively compared current contemporary America with late stage Soviet Union, because he said he sensed a degree of moral exhaustion and a kind of fashionability for nihilism. I guess what you're arguing is against nihilism. It's what you want is to restore a sense of the good, not just to how we think about ourselves, but about American foreign policy too. Is that fair?
Yeah, even a kind of innocence, if I can
Right.
use that word, that
Well,
we should.
that's hard to recreate innocence. And you've got to be,
Yeah.
I mean, you wrote another interesting piece, Beware, warning us about the allure of nostalgia. We have to be careful with that too, don't we?
Yes, for sure. And I was being a little bit playful there about the word innocence, but I do think that sometimes the pretense is useful, because even if it's just a pretense of doing good in the world, at least that reminds American citizens of what we're supposed to be about. It reminds the rest of the world of our better angels. And I don't forget how when I was in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring, the activists there in Egypt, they were hanging on the words of the US. Barack Obama gave several speeches during that period, and they knew that America was at least partly their hope. That if Obama said the right words and put the right amount of pressure on Mubarak, that's what would facilitate a democratic transition. And they were right about that. Obama did put pressure on Mubarak, and Mubarak stepped down, or actually was forced out of power. So I think, and when Syrian dissidents were fighting for their lives also during the Arab Spring, they didn't call on the US to support their struggle. They didn't call on China or Russia to support their struggle. They called on the US to support their struggle. The same thing with Libyan activists. So they had a sense that America was capable of being better than it actually was. And there's something really powerful in that we might forget who we are, but others in other parts of the world, they still have this sense that America stands for something. And I think that is a very inspiring thing to remember, because I think too often Americans, they don't realize what the alternative is because they haven't lived under dictatorship. I know more about that because I have lived under dictatorships, and also my parents came from one. So I think that when you grow up with that sense as a child of immigrants, you're always being reminded that American democracy is not something to be taken for granted.
Yeah, and finally, you introduce a word for this. It's actually a word that I wasn't familiar with. It's a word called asymptote. I think that's the right way of pronouncing it. Asymptote. You say that that's what America is, or that's what summarizes the dilemma and the opportunity for America. Finally, Shadi, what does this word mean, and why does it capture the spirit of your new book, The Case for American Power?
Well, I'm glad you brought asymptote up, Andrew. It's a mathematical concept that is not particularly well known, but I came across it and I thought, wow, I do love this idea. It's the idea of a curve that is close to intersecting with a line, but never quite intersects with it completely. And this is a powerful idea because America is an asymptote, that we're never going to be perfect. We're never going to completely fulfill our promise, but we can curve towards it gradually and incrementally, and we can get closer to where we want to be. But the only way that's possible is if we remind our fellow Americans of that possibility and not allow them to fall into nihilism or cynicism. And this is where the hope is going to be on the left and not on the right. The right has fallen into cynicism under Donald Trump. There isn't even a pretense that Donald Trump offers to our greater ideals. But that is part of the progressive history, is that what do we want? Progress. When do we want it? If not now, at least at some point in the future. So I think that is something that we have to be reminded of constantly, that we're moving closer to that line, even if we never fully intersect with it.
Well, that's a very, very provocative argument, but it's one I've actually been waiting for. It makes a lot of sense, and it's very hard to actually argue against it. The Case for American Power by Shadi Hamid, who's as well positioned as anyone to make it. Congratulations, Shadi, on the new book. My only suggestion is you need to get an American flag behind you.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. That would be good for promoting the book, I suppose. Yeah.
Well,
But thanks
next
so much,
time you're on
Andrew.
the show, you'll have to put the flag up. But congratulations on the book. Fascinating conversation, and best of luck. Best of luck in your debates with the AOCs and Bernie Sanders of the world. Be interesting to see how they respond.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew. Great to be with you.